Thank you so much for being here. The four of us sitting up here had a meeting some months ago and talked about the value of a land acknowledgement and the danger, I guess, also of a land acknowledgement. Florence put it so well when she spoke in February, when she accompanied the land acknowledgement with her comments. And she said that she saw a land acknowledgement as a reminder, and we've certainly been doing that now. For a year at the Bethel College Mennonite Church, the first Sunday of every month, we have read the land acknowledgement to remind us. But the fear, of course, sometimes is that it's easy enough to read that the first Sunday of the month and feel like, okay, we've been reminded, we go on about our ways. It is also a recognition, and of course we want to use it as that here. We want to recognize what it means to acknowledge the land. And Florence also said it is a desire to seek out those harmed in acts of restorative justice. But how do we do that? And several of you have spoken to me about your own thinking and feeling, and I think spoken to others who are sitting up here today. And so what we thought would be very useful at this point, after a year of reading the land acknowledgement together, is to sit together and hear your thoughts and your responses as you have heard that. And what we have thought about this next time together this morning is that it would be a good time to hear your questions, your comments, your doubts, your ideas. Simply reflect on what it has meant to listen for a year to the land acknowledgement. What are some of the thoughts you've had, and so forth. We are gathered together as resources. I think you know Karin Kaufman Wall with MCC. She's been working for 10 years on dismantling the doctrine of discovery, training. I did the training with her doing the Loss of Turtle Island simulation event. How many of you have been in on a Loss of Turtle Island experience? Looks like 15, maybe 10, 15. Anyway, she would be here this morning to talk further about any of these resources and to respond perhaps to questions that people might have. You know Florence as a part of this church. Florence has been known in dismantling doctrine of discovery circles for some years now for a very valuable friendship she made with Pauline Sharp when we were, the three of us, I think, were all involved with Karen and Erica Littlewolf's leading us through a training MCC sponsored for couple of days here in North Newton at the MCC Center. Has that been 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 4? I'm looking at Florence. I don't expect you to remember, Karen. Anyway, she's done a good bit of writing. She has made some decisions about her own land, and she has developed a friendship with Pauline Sharp, a representative of the Kanza people. You all know Nathan, and he has a passion for this issue and sort of called us together to talk about where do we go from here. So I wrote the announcement in the bulletin, and that's really the way I would like for us to proceed today. Land acknowledgement, then what? Nikki Sanchez speaks to those of us who are part of the settler legacy Where you find yourself today may not be your fault, but it is absolutely your responsibility. And I like spelling it responsibility. We are able to respond to this, and we need to think about ways we could do so. At least I am convicted by that. Now, here's the other thing. There are individual responses, something like Florence has done. John Stace made the circles around here and talked about his own response. And there are group responses, and more the church as an institution is responding. So today we can talk about all of those. And individuals respond so differently according to your own history and your own conviction. And then here is the lead question. If thinking about the land acknowledgement read each first Sunday of the month has led you to wish to talk to other seekers, to ask your questions, to make your comments, to voice your doubts, to think about what's next, then join us for an open discussion. So the first part of that, the first part of our next few minutes together, we covet your responses, and we would love to hear from you. And then if you're asking for resources, we have a ton of them. And there will be things that we can suggest, all four of us. So can we do that? Is there someone who would open by posing a question, making a suggestion, responding to anything within the last year? Nathan will... Thank you, Ada.
Just to get us started, I guess I've been thinking, even before this last year, about what to do with my own land. Wes and I have inherited land, and that adds to the responsibility, I think. And so that's one question that I have, and I wonder whether others are in that same situation.
We are in a little bit in that situation, but what I wanted to say is that during this pandemic time, we have some land that that my father had up near Wichita, and it's in grassland, and I just can't count the number of times during the pandemic, during the political division in our country, when we have gone out there to chop down cedars, to just work and work on that land, how privileged we have felt, and I think it awakened in me an appreciation for what life could have been, might have been like for people who lived on the land and cared for it with a minimal amount of equipment, or not having to, we don't have to do anything but make the grass, let the grass grow. And the other thing, we were talking with someone who has it for us, who is, I believe, on in another political realm. And we both stood around and were just talking about how grateful we were to have this opportunity to be out on that land. And so I just wanted to, I think that's a motivation for me, and I feel a tiny bit of connection to people who lived outside on the land.
I want to follow that up just with the rest of the story after what I gave you this morning. We had been working at Southern Hills, and I had been working on the story of my family's land, just a half section of land east of Liberal, Kansas, where I grew up, Dust Bowl land. And I had been working on that story for years. And just probably as a result of my interaction with Lawrence Hart, Chief Lawrence Hart, the Cheyenne Mennonite minister, I had been looking deeply into that land, clear back to the year 1000, when in that area the Plains Village farmers were along the Beaver River a few miles from our family land. And so I had been developing a deep appreciation for who had been on that land for centuries, including which native peoples had lived nearby, and the story of Coronado looking for the Quivira, looking for the cities of gold, and finally finding the village of Quivira and crossing right across our land. And, just finding the story of the land. But somehow that also ended up being the story of my family migrations, 500 years, as I was telling you. And my ability to respond to this became, as I studied more deeply the Kanza people, became, how do you tell this story? And I thought of all the years of, Mennonite stories about coming to the land. How do we tell the truth? How do we tell the truth about how we got the land? How do we tell the truth about our privilege in pushing someone else away? It started in Russia, I'm sure it started much before then, but we know the stories of the Mennonites in the Ukraine with the Nogai people. And so my first response was to try, and I don't think I've done it well, but I went back to that book I was working on, and I tried to tell the truth about who we were as farmers. So sometimes I think whether you own land or not, part of it is to ask yourself to tell the truth about who you are and how you got there. And the book that I mentioned, Healing Haunted Histories, really gave me, really provoked me to think about myself today not living on the land, because Elaine Entz and Ched Myers argue in there that we just keep resettling. We are settlers carrying a settler's mindset. And whether we live on the land or not, we just keep resettling. And that's about our attitudes about the land and privilege and who we are. And she defines very carefully the difference between a settler who comes in and writes the rules, and someone else like the indigenous people who just accept the rules of the land. They don't rewrite the rules. I haven't said that well. Somebody help me define
what... the difference between settlers and immigrants. Yeah. The difference between settlers and immigrants.
Yeah,
and natives.
That's what I'm not saying. The difference between settlers and immigrants is that immigrants come in as guests on the land and live according to the rules of the land. Settlers take it over, own it, rewrite it, which makes my people always settlers. Okay, I got way off, but eventually, what I wanted to say is, Doug and I had an experience like yours, Margaret, going back to our land in east of Liberal and clearing the cedars this last December, December 2020. And, fell in love again with the land in a different non-farming mode. But I think a lot with Ada about what we do with that land eventually when we sell it.
I too have land for my family, and I've been squirming about this for a long time. My dad squirmed about it. But I heard about the Seattle Mennonite Church paying rent to the native tribe that lived there. And I thought, oh, that's a pretty cool idea. So I contacted Brian Stuckey, who's a local self-made historian about native matters, and because I wanted to have information from him about, which tribe or tribes would have occupied that my acreage. his reflection on the rent idea was that that would seem odd to people who don't see land in terms of ownership. And I thought, yeah, that's very, I thought that was very wise. Well, and to me too, it often seems kind of a cheap answer to just give some money. You know, I would long for a relationship like Florence has with Pauline. And I don't know how to get there, but I think relationship might be an important. Yeah.
Yes, I feel very privileged to have that relationship, and it was Karin that introduced us when we were selling our family land, and I didn't know how to go about that, giving any money back or anything, and so I asked Karin, and she said, well, I think I know someone that might be able to help you, and she introduced me to Pauline, and our relationship has gone from there. And in fact, the Kaw Nation set up a way to receive money through the Kanza Heritage Society. But the one thing that I've learned, and John Stace really emphasized this, is that sometimes the one person in the tribe becomes kind of the point person. It's someone that has maybe been more able to relate to settler culture, that has maybe had some education, some leadership, some jobs that are articulate. And that person kind of becomes a point person for the tribe, and then they kind of get burnt out. And so he said that sometimes, and Pauline did tell me, she said, well, I just can't be a friend with all Mennonites. And so I do feel very privileged, and that's one reason that we put on the Kaufman Museum website where we talk back and forth about our two histories. So that is available to everybody, and we don't have to keep telling that story. I think the one thing that we can keep doing is just reading a lot, going to places where we learn about the culture. In Council Grove, there is the Kaw Mission, which tells a story of, I'm not sure it was being repurposed, and the story was being retold. They were putting up new exhibits, and so it's been closed for a while, but I hope it's open soon, maybe is even now. And so the Kaw Mission, and also that tells a story about the Kaw people and the Kaw Mission. It was a Methodist mission for the people. For a long time, Ronald Parks was the curator there, and he has written a book, The Darkest Period, which I would recommend to anybody that would like to know the history of the Kaw, especially during the time of their removal. But it tells the whole story, and then the time of their removal, which is a really good history. There's also Ronald Parks, and it's The Darkest Period. And I have a book here if anyone would like to. I'd be willing to loan it to you. It's Ronald Parks, The Darkest Period. Also, there is Alagawahu Memorial Heritage Park in Council Grove, and that is a place that's good to go and see. You can also go down to the Kaw Nation and drive around there, and they have a museum there also about Kaw history. So those are the ways you can inform yourself about the history. Now, there are a lot more tribes that were here in Kansas other than the three that I say. that I have kind of included in the land acknowledgement. If you include all the tribes that were here in Kansas, it gets a long list, and I just thought that became kind of clumsy. So I just included those three. There were also several tribes like the Delaware and the Shawnee, I think maybe even the Potawatomi, no, I'm not sure. They were pushed east here before Oklahoma became a state, and we were kind of the Indian territory at one point in history. So they were pushed from the east and settled here. So there are a few reservations here in Kansas in the southeast. And so there are ways that we can begin to learn their history. Several really novelists, they're becoming more and more indigenous novelists. Louise Erdrich is a good person to read. Joy Harjo, she does a lot of writing poetry, but she's also written several, I think one's just coming out, but she's written autobiographies of her life. One, and that's out, and I think she just coming out, writing another one, and I saw her, I just saw her on a Zoom presentation this last week where she was talking about that, and it was through Haskell Indian School, which is still a native school here in Kansas, at the Haskell Indian School, which might be another interesting place to go. I've never been there, so.
Well, I want to read, and Karen, I think you know of lots of more creative ways. There are all kinds of reparations being talked about now, not just giving money from your land, or to whom do you give it. I mean, at one point, the Cheyennes were, where my land is, east of Liberal in the southwest corner of Kansas. Early on, a portion of that, a quarter of that end of Kansas was part of a Cheyenne reservation. And because I know we have, as Mennonites, many Cheyenne contacts, I've often thought, I know of the huge need of the Northern Cheyennes and have contacts there through the Mennonites. You know, if I sold my land, maybe I'd give it there, you know. I don't know. But I want to read something that convicted me and let you think about this too, about the problem with land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements are not harmful, we believe, if they are done in a way that is respectful of the indigenous nations who claim the land, accurately tell the story of how the land passed from indigenous to non-indigenous control, and chart a path forward for redressing the harm. What many indigenous people want is a clear statement that the land needs to be restored to the indigenous nation or nations. This is not as unrealistic as you think. There are many creative ways to take restorative measures. We try to be, as we think about restorative justice, we try to be creative whenever it's a simple conflict between people. I mean, it isn't tit for tat. Such as by returning U.S. national parks to the appropriate tribes. You know, there's a movement underway to think about that. Land acknowledgements must reveal a sincere commitment to respecting and enhancing indigenous sovereignty. If an acknowledgement is discomforting and triggers uncomfortable conversations versus self-congratulation, it's probably on the right track. You know, and one thing I think has been so important for me in my journey is just learning. Just learning, you know, like the thing I shared this morning. Just learning about what actually happened and telling the truth. Do you want to respond, Karen, to reparations? And there's some really creative work going on in terms of LMCC, and I keep getting things. I wanted to mention also that, before I hand you this mic, Heidi Regier-Kreider, our Western District Conference Director, Executive, I don't know what her official, just did, on her sabbatical, she's written about it on the website, the WDC website, she did a study of healing haunted histories with Elaine online, I think a 4-month study, an intense study. And I met with her last week to see whether there might be opportunities for us, that Western District could provide for us some group work or some more study work on this. I told you I would love to start all over with this book and study it again with a group of people because it's a workbook and there's a lot in there. And she also wrote a little article on the website. I made a few copies, and I think I didn't get them in here this morning, but I'll go get them when we're finished if somebody would like, with some resources. And maybe you put yourself on your own little study journey to begin with. Maybe we offer Turtle Island again in this congregation for people who would like to have that experience, the loss of Turtle Island, and just understand. I mean, it's really good on intersections with Mennonite history, and I think we all need access to that. It's very much related to creation care. There are lots of things related to creation care we could do as reparations. But I'm getting into Karen's territory, maybe.
I'm kind of wishing that I had prepared something. I came literally just to respond to things, and now I'm wishing I had prepared something because, well, I was just going to say, because I'm afraid I could talk for hours about these topics. This is something that that I have worked a long time on and I care a lot about. Let me just say that land acknowledgement is something that comes out of a deeper understanding of studying the doctrine of discovery. And we throw that term around, and maybe not everybody has heard that term or knows what it means, and so I think it's worth saying that it is a philosophical and theological framework that most people trace back to papal bulls, 1452 and so forth. There are at least 3 papal bulls that are commonly referred to that basically started that age of conquest where people were able to, go out, seek the lands and conquer the lands in the name of the crown. And this is, again, the Christian authority. Again, we've got empire happening. And subjugate all the peoples you meet therein, because if they are not Christian, they are not fully human. All right, so this is a process that started. We would like to think that that's long over, but if you study it, and that's part of what the exercise that Erica Littlewolf and I developed called The Loss of Turtle Island, is to understand how these processes changed and developed and morphed and are still very active today, and very much function to invisibilize indigenous peoples and culture. And so I do think it's very important. Prior to the pandemic, Erica and I traveled all over the country doing that exercise, too much, trying to change how we do that. But we talked with many, many people about their responses to that and their struggles with understanding these issues, and encountered a few very common responses, which I just want to name. And the first is people would say that they felt anger, that this was not something they were taught in schools. This is not the history that they learned, or they learned a sanitized version of it, or they didn't really learn the whole truth. So I think education is very important. And I think, if I may go out on the limb to say, I think education in our school system and the efforts that are currently happening to prevent certain kinds of materials from being presented to our students, even in our own school district, are extremely harmful and something that we have the opportunity to speak to if we want our children to learn the history more fully than we did. Secondly, a response that I hear is people feel bad, they feel guilt, they feel shame, which I often try to tell people I think is a very human and normal response and probably an appropriate feeling to move through. But it's not the point of the exercise, and it's not a helpful or healthy place to stay. So we try to encourage people to move beyond that. Some of the things that, I'm just going to point out a few of the resources that both MCC and through our partnership and our participation on what is an Anabaptist coalition called Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery. And I think that's an excellent group to get involved with, and the materials that are put out. But I want to make you aware, there is a Bible Reflections. If you are interested in examining this from a theological perspective, this would make a good study. There is, I brought my bag of goods, a general study guide trying to understand more deeply what the doctrine of discovery is. And I think some of you have some experience with this one. There is a large display of panels that we created to sort of walk through the timeline of how the doctrine of discovery was carried out. And then this is sort of a miniature version of that timeline, just to give you an idea of how this is played out through history. So I got a bunch of those. And then the two newest ones that have just been printed are these two called the Land Acknowledgement Guide. This is sort of helps walk through what might be some ways of working at land acknowledgement. And then along with that is a more in-depth study called the Stories of Repair. Now, quite honestly, I don't think this is a good starting point into the conversation. This is after you have already done some learning and understanding and you're at the point of what to do. I think it's important to have a more fundamental understanding before diving into what to do. But this examines a number of creative responses, including the idea of real rent. And with all due respect to Brian, financial donations can be given as a gift with no strings attached instead of as rent. It can be thought of as what I need to do as an ongoing sign of my commitment to making things right. So there are many people who do that, or lots of other creative responses. And I think it's really important to also say that this isn't just about territory. I've had people say, well, that doesn't apply to me because we don't own land. But this is so much more than about land itself and territory and who owns it and who gets to occupy it. Because the removal of peoples whose spirituality is essentially tied to the land itself is a rupture of culture and spirituality. It's a decimation of language and families, and that continues. And so I really encourage people to think about the larger systems that are at play and the ongoing invisibilization of indigenous peoples. You don't have to own land, you got here somehow. I'll say that at MCC Central States, one of the most helpful things that we did was for a series of months, each of us took the time to do research on a piece of land or a particular nation that we felt a connection to explore that history and to learn more about it. And then we took turns at each staff meeting, and we'd do a presentation. And for me, I would say it was very transformative. I knew some of this history, but I'd never really sat down to study it and put it all together. Where I researched, having grown up in Freeman, South Dakota, the land that I told all three different stories interwoven. One is the story of this new nation of the United States that's being formed, and these laws that are being created, and how it's happening, that this is that the expansion is happening of this young nation. And at the same time, there's this group of people that have been migrating from one place to another in Europe and finally ending in current day Ukraine. And what did they know? What did they know prior to leaving? And I found writings of my great-grandfather where he said, do we stay and become subject to the Tsar and our young men taken? Or do we risk this journey and risk being scalped by the savages? Well, it taught me a lot about what messages they had received and the propaganda they had been told. That doesn't set a groundwork for good relationships. And now, in the last couple of weeks, we hear many people remembering their ancestors' move from Ukraine and other places, but especially we're thinking of Ukraine these days. And we have to ask ourselves what happened. What happened for people who had to leave their land to so quickly forget what that separation feels like? Or did they know? I did a lot of research to find what they knew, what was written about, and there's very little, and what's there seems very harmful. So I really encourage everyone to do that kind of individual, and I didn't even mention that I was also at the same time researching the story of the Ihangtawan, the Yankton Sioux people, for whose land, and I'm fortunate to have relationships there as well. And that is really important that you said that, Florence. The goal of this is not to run out and try to make friends with an Indigenous person. There's so much education that we can do, and that is a part of building relationship. And so.
I would just like to say that the Dismantling of the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition have a podcast. And if you go to the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery on a podcast, it's 12 sessions. It is just wonderful. If you are a person that drives regularly and can listen to it in the car or whatever, it's a very good way, I think, to get to understand the doctrine of discovery. And the coalition is also doing a lot of work with how to dismantle the doctrine of discovery.
Just a couple more things about the coalition itself. So one of the things that the coalition has started, we've talked a long time about what we call the ladder of engagement. Like, people start out just, for many people, the loss of Turtle Island is like first introduction they've ever had to this. And then where do we move from there, and what are some other educational resources? And then we have some groups or whole congregations that are very committed to this and want to really work at this in meaningful ways. So they have started a network that they call the Repair Network of congregations that have committed to ongoing work and have regular meetings. I presented on a panel there, for example, and they're asking really good questions and really learning good things, and I learn from them too. I mean, Raylene, you make me out to be an expert, but I'm learning very much along the way. And I wanted to throw out a couple more books for people who like books. If you are creation-oriented and want to learn about that relationship, the indigenous spirituality and connection to the land, which is also work that we can do to recover within our own spirits, I think Braiding Sweetgrass is the title of the book by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I've been in about 4 book studies of it, but I would do it again. Okay, I got at least 2 copies too. That's in the library, easy to get a hold of. Another one is The Land Is Not Empty by Sarah Augustine, who's one of the founding members of the coalition. And I find her book to be really helpful in terms of examining what the doctrine of discovery looks like in an individual's life, and her work internationally to work at overturning or undoing the doctrine of discovery. So,
Are there others who came to speak?
It seems to me that part of telling the truth about the Mennonite settlement story, it's already been intimated that involves a whole lot more than simply taking over the land that other people used to live on. Margot has a former fellow teacher from Heston, a Methodist, I might add. They have a mound in their backyard, and they figured out along the way that might have some significance. And in fact, in checking with anthropologists and people at the state, it's quite clearly a burial mound. And so they have made every attempt to preserve it and make sure that they've been advised, oh, you should level that, and you could put a little stream in there or something. Anyway, and then the other story that I heard, and I cannot verify that this is true, but it was told to me as though it was true, and I really have no doubt that it probably is true, of the Mennonite farmer who decided that he wanted to start raising fish. So he got a bunch of earth-moving equipment to dig a big pond, and the person who told me this said that he may well have destroyed the largest burial ground for Native Americans in the state of Kansas. And I wonder how much that is part of the truth of our settlement of the land. Pretty scary to think about.
To your first comment, Dale, one thing that's so wonderful about Elaine Myers, we should not discount the trauma of our ancestors and the pain and what they were carrying as they came over here. And wherever they moved and their dislocation, you alluded to it. But healing haunted histories includes the haunted histories of our Mennonite forebears and their stories. We need to know those stories as you recounted them. You know, the first thing that people ask me whenever we talk about land acknowledgements is, well, I don't think they knew anything. Our ancestors didn't know what was going on. And it's really hard to find out what they knew. But that doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, we are here now, and we are responsible. Janet, you wanted to speak. Nathan, I guess Nathan is taking this one.
When Karin said that land being taken over started with the popes and the papal bulls, I said, what about all the Israelites that were wandering in the wilderness and who took over Canaan at God's judgment? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it's the most common referential point because it was done in the name of the Christian church.
And it's a legal document that's still embedded in our legal system.
Oh,
It's what we got our property laws, our
Mm-hmm.
land laws are based on.
okay, but it's not new that people have moved.
you've mentioned a nice variety of resources. Would it be possible that the list could be compiled and either sent out on the church email or posted for people who don't have that access?
Absolutely. I was thinking, there are a bunch of people here, and how can you hear all of these? We'll at least put together, for those who want it, what we've mentioned today. But
what we're doing here today, and the regular reading of the land acknowledgement statement from our pulpit, is a prime example of the kind of influence that church should be on a personal life, if not on society as a whole. About the time that the land acknowledgement statement was beginning to be read regularly from our pulpit, I was asked by the Scully Ranch land manager to film the Santa Fe Trail from the air. And two things hit me as I started to learn where the trail was. First of all, some of the dramatic land erosions that were occurring along the deepest part of the rut system of the trail. And then under certain lighting conditions and from a certain altitude, you could see the trail winding its way to the southwest like an 8-lane freeway. And it hit me like a ton of bricks when I first saw that. This is a symbol of what the white man did to the red man. So, remembering our land acknowledgement statement being read regularly from our pulpit, I told the land manager who asked me to do this filming and make a presentation to the Santa Fe Trail Association that I would have to start my presentation out with a land acknowledgement statement. And I gave him some background. By this time I had sort of figured out who this man was. And he said, "Oh, that's fine. You're speaking to the choir. I'm married to a Kaw Indian woman her name has been raised here this morning, and her name is Pauline Sharp." Anyway, I just bring this up to, I'll also say that my next meeting, a presentation of this filming that I had done, was to an association of Kansas farmers. And I went into that meeting with a little bit of fear and trepidation, wondering how a land acknowledgement statement would be received there. But I was encouraged to do so by our example from our own pulpit. In any case, it was well received. And I think that gives me courage to continue being public about this sort of thing. Thank you, church leadership, for your influence on my life.
I also just want to say I think we'll probably go to about quarter till, so we can have some comments. I wouldn't mind ending with some maybe more direct wanderings, if that's true, of what some next steps for our church might be. So we'll start moving in that direction.
Well, two quick thoughts. As many of us, our ancestors came here about 150 years ago. Mine settled in western Harvey County along the Turkey Creek. History didn't start 150 years ago, as we all know. Ray Regier, who farmed a mile away, goes to our church. One year at Kaufman Museum, he bought a pile of artifacts, shards and arrowheads. Some of our local experts, Kevin Hebert and John Torline, reviewed them, and some were hundreds of years old, and a few were 6,000 years old in their best estimates. That's a long time ago, right here, and I know the same thing is true east of campus here. My grandparents inherited that land. My grandfather was fortunate to be a good farmer, invested money in land in western Kansas. And 2 years ago, I didn't know this was an option, but speaking to the question of what to do, we discovered an option. It's not returning the land to prairie, but through the help of Everence, we could create a donor advised fund from the monies that were sold from some of that land, and it can keep giving forward for years and hopefully way beyond our life.
I might transition back to you, Raylene, to start to maybe tie some of this together. But one thing I want to...
No, I wish you'd finish it.
Well,
what's next?
okay. One thing, connections I just have to make. Healing Haunted Histories, Raylene Hinz is the primary author, but her partner is Ched Myers, who was mentioned last week in my sermon, also mentioned this week in Janine's sermon. He is a biblical scholar of, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best, and I could preach from his Binding the Strong Man on Mark for the rest of my life, and probably will. So you'll hear much more of Ched Myers over the years, hopefully. And so, but this then is his partner's book, and she's written other things too on what we've been talking about today. So how the stream of biblical studies matches or flows into this stream of our conversation is, to me, very exciting. And this book is wonderful. Anything that Ched Myers writes is also wonderful. So we will hear more about these people in the future. And I think one thing that Raylene already threw out as a possible option that maybe we would want to explore is doing some kind of study on healing haunted histories. We've heard other resources that are available for a congregational setting. I'm not sure where to go. I think just by the amount of people that are here, which is very encouraging, I think we do have some energy to continue to think about and study and discuss lots of different things. And so that's the question, is perhaps where to start. If you have suggestions, now might be a good time to suggest some of that. I'm happy to pass the mic around. I guess we could just, maybe get a nod or something. Is this something that we want to continue to explore?
I think for at least me as an individual, recognizing that some of us do get a lot of energy from the discussions, and they're fantastic, to be able to have educational opportunities, not only for us, but for our children in this congregation too. I think that's very important. My energy gets depleted pretty quickly with multiple conversations. And so where I think for at least me and maybe others in the congregation would be more towards the doing. And what do we do now after we have learned the history of the land that we have here, and more towards the doing. But I do see opportunities and understand that other folks want to have the learning aspect as well.
As far as reparations, in Georgetown, the students really wanted to give something back to, it was built by slave labor, and this is what they said. This is not being framed as a matter of collective guilt. This is being framed as an act of collective generosity. It is really an expression of gratitude. The students are saying of the Georgetown slaves, their story is our story, and we want to share our resources with the families that made our university possible. And I just thought that was I just really like that statement.
Well, when I began thinking about this, one of the first things I did was to become a charter member of the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian, and have maintained that membership, because it seems to me that the important thing is to spread the stories of these indigenous peoples and how they lived and so on. And that occurs in the operation of that museum. There also are a lot of indigenous charities that work to spread information and to help develop the communities to maintain their own heritage. There's the Native American Heritage Association, the Native American Rights Fund, the Indigenous Peoples, or Indigenous, let's see, what is it? First Nations Development Institute, Running Strong for American Indian Youth. There are a number of these that we can help to provide some resources so that they can maintain their activities.
Since you mentioned museums, I wonder about the museum right next to us, Kaufman Museum, and what is the responsibility that they have in telling the Mennonite story and those who were here before. What does that story look like? Do we have any part in helping to shape that story and ask those questions? That's a partnership that I'm interested in possibly developing. Well, it's quarter till. I think we might leave it with this. And if you're particularly interested in thinking more about this and helping some of us get organized, I would welcome having a conversation with you to help think through what next steps might be. So please be in touch. And I do imagine there will be streams of this conversation that continue to flow, and we will work together to try to gather most, if not all, of the resources that we've mentioned and put them on an email. Okay. So Karin has stuff right here, right now, and boxes and boxes at MCC. So talk to her afterwards if you want some of the stuff she mentioned, and we'll try to put it out on one of our emails so you can at least become aware of those resources. Thank you so much for being a part of this discussion, and this is a beginning of a journey, and I'm excited where it could take us as individuals and also as a congregation. So thank you.